All right. So we've been talking about the causes of disunity in the United States over the last couple of weeks, and I'd like to focus in on one of the final aspects of the causes of disunity. And in talking about this, we've been talking about the idea of increased partisanship, right? So on the one hand, we've seen kind of the breakdown of the ability for Republicans and Democrats to be able to compromise. Part of that has been the demise of kind of the Southern conservatives and Southern conservative Democrats and Northeastern liberal Republicans. Parties have become more homogenous ideologically, so Republicans are much more likely to be conservatives and Democrats much more likely to be liberals. And as a consequence of that, we've seen the parties basically not being able to compromise on anything. Second thing we've seen is the idea of structural causes of partisan gridlock. Now, when we think in terms of the structural causes of partisan gridlock, these are by very nature part and parcel of our American government system. So you might ask yourself, well, if these have always been there and these factors have always been there, why is it that all of a sudden now they're a cause of disunity? Well, I think, in many respects, part of it is because of the other factors, they exacerbate the disunity that we have. So things like, for example, having separation of powers and checks and balances where the president can be of one political party and Congress can be of the other. In hyper-partisan years, that essentially means that if we had divided government with the president of one party and Congress of the other, ultimately, because of partisanship, they continue to check each other to the point of really not being able to accomplish much of anything. We also talked about the idea of sorting out, and that notion is that people are increasingly stopping, no longer hanging out with people that are dissimilar to themselves. Most of our friends and our acquaintances are fundamentally people that agree with us. A lot of this has to do with geography and where we live. So again, if you live in an urban area, you're much more likely to be a Democrat. If you live in a rural area, you're much more likely to be a Republican. And the suburbs are contested so that on the one hand, you have kind of typically inner ring suburbs tend to be more Democratic. As you get farther out to what we call the exurbs, they tend to be more Republican. And again, this is not to say that there are no Republicans in cities and no Democrats in rural areas. There certainly are. But you tend to find concentrations of political parties and people that view life similarly to you. And it may not all just be political party. It may be certain fundamental values that you believe in that deal with people around you. So there are two more things to talk about. Sorry about that. One thing that we'll talk about today in this segment is the idea of political rhetoric contributing to the causes of disunity. And the second is the idea of ideology, which will be in a second series of discussions that we will have. So let's take a look at political rhetoric. There's a book called The Outrage Industry, and that's kind of where I've got some of this material from. I think it's very important. Jeffrey Berry is a very prominent political scientist, and he's one of the co-authors here. I would ask you, I cannot in this video run the actual interview that's here. If I did, it would show up on the screen, but there would be no audio, which defeats the purpose of doing this. So what I'd ask you to do is to go into the PowerPoints and shared files and listen to the interview with Barry, because I think it's very important to understanding kind of the theories behind this and the rise of this so-called outrage industry. But I'd like to raise a number of things in relationship to what Barry and his co-author are talking about here. And there's, again, if you click through to that Outrage link there, you can see that there's a transcript of another interview with the authors. So what is outrage, and how does it manifest itself, and why? Right? So essentially in the outrage industry, what we see is that there's this discussion about the fact that in recent decades, we've had the development of a press and a media that's much more focused on trying to create controversy, trying to appeal to certain ideologies than it is to kind of report unbiased facts. And there's a lot of kind of reasons for this. I think, one thing that people point to is the idea of the decline of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. And the Fairness Doctrine essentially required that stations and either radio stations or television stations provided both sides of an argument. If they were allow somebody that was come on and talk to be a liberal, they also had to have a conservative viewpoint. That was the idea of the fairness doctrine, so that you get multiple points of view. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, did away with that in 1987, and as a consequence of that, you could now have, and particularly it started on radio, you could have ideologically homogenous radio shows. So you saw, initially kind of the rise of conservative talk show radio, and you could have a conservative perspective without having to have a liberal alternative, which was required under the fairness doctrine. So in some respects, this has allowed kind of the remaking of the American political media landscape. We could obviously have a debate on whether or not the fairness doctrine is a good idea or not. That's not the point, I think, for Barry's argument here. The idea is that had a fundamental effect on the way that American media is focused. In addition to that, we've had the rise of the internet, the rise of cable television, which makes a lot more different media outlets available, and segments the population into much smaller segments so that you can find what you want ideologically. So what's this idea of outrage that's kind of been spurred? They talk about a couple things. First is the effort to promote emotional responses, right? So anger about issues, potential fear about what might happen if the other side gets what they want, moral indignation. Look at these people and what they're doing, right? What we see in the outrage industry is that they create overgeneralizations, sensationalize things. You can at some points have misleading or actually incorrect or wrong information, ad hominem attacks. In other words, you attack somebody just on the basis of who they know and what's associated with them, and really the idea that we have people on just to belittle them, right? One of the fundamental things about the outrage industry is that the complexity of issues is never really discussed, right? It's really kind of politics as entertainment. If we sit down and do a free-form 25-minute interview with 4 different people that understand different sides of every issue, people get bored with that kind of stuff. What do we like? We like melodrama. We like people to be mocked. We like hyperbole. This is going to be the end of the world if this happens, right? These are all things that make for good theatrical entertainment, so that politics is no longer kind of boring public policy discussions, but politics is entertainment, and we get outraged by it, and it evokes emotions, right? And then finally, it lacks deliberation, right? We talk a little bit about the value of kind of Congress being a deliberative institution, but one thing that probably good discussions about public policy should do is to help us to think in different ways, to think about different perspectives, to believe that, well, there may be other people out there that believe something differently than I do, and that's a valid perspective. That's not something that these television shows try to do. There's our perspective, there's their perspective. Ours is right, theirs is wrong, and there's no need for us to kind of consider the value of who they are and what they are, right? Now, what are the characteristics of outrage? Well, the outrage industry talks about a couple of things. One is that these shows, whether they be on television or whether they be on radio, are fundamentally focused on specific personalities. So think to yourself for just 1 second, who would be the type of personality-centered television show or radio show that you might think of? Well, Rush Limbaugh, perhaps, on the right. Rachel Maddow on the left on MSNBC, right? And they create their own schemes and their own followers and their own personality. And people follow those people, and they have, either a daily following on the radio like Limbaugh, or else a nightly following on television like Rachel Maddow. Another characteristic of the outrage industry is oftentimes these personalities are very reactive to what goes on. In other words, they're not there to talk about brand new news. They're not there to break news. What they're there is to react to issues that would be important to the people that that listen to them, right? So I find an issue that's important. President Trump says something today, and I come out tomorrow and we react to them. Can you believe what this person said? Or President Obama, can you believe what he said? And then you try to take a look at what other people on the other side have said, and then you critique them. So you're not really creating new news. What you're doing is reacting to other people's visions of the news, and then you're creating the conservative or liberal position that's outraged by what people are saying on the other side. There's ideological selectivity, right? So turn on some night, two separate television shows, one on MSNBC, one on Fox. And if they're talk shows, maybe you got Bill O'Reilly on Fox and Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, and watch the first 5 minutes of the show. What's the lineup? What are they going to discuss that night? And you'll see probably fundamentally different things, even though the events of the day have been the same. Why? Because they don't want to have a broad range of issues. They want to throw, quote unquote, red meat to their audience. What is that's important to me as a conservative? What is that's important to me as a liberal? That's what you're going to see. They're engaging. So they create a very interesting political theater, right? It's fun to watch these programs, particularly if you agree with them, right? Barry talks about this almost as being kind of, people that go to church, right? If you share the values of these people, you're basically preaching to the choir, and that allows us to sit there and listen to what these people are saying and say, right on, yeah, go ahead, yeah, you tell them, right? And they create different aspects of their television show that are theatrical and are engaging. One thing that they talk about also is the idea of internal intertextuality, which is basically just the idea that, look, this is a big scene. There are certain players in this, and individual personalities rely on other personalities in order to be able to create boogeymen, right? So, if Rush Limbaugh says something today on one show, Rachel Maddow is going to critique it on another show. Rush Limbaugh has certain people that he likes to critique on an ongoing basis, and basically every time he says something about them, they say something about him, and that creates more content, right? We got 3 hours to fill in a given day, and basically recurring themes come along. And what you said about me, I'm going to respond to you, right? And this is a very important part of the outrage industry. You have to create context or content, and internal intertextuality is the way to do that. I create my list of enemies. What are my enemies saying? What are they talking about me today? I need to respond to that. Again, the idea that they're reactive. And then finally, the idea of mirroring. So there are common uses among conservatives and liberals, right, in using this outrage industry to their advantage, right? So you always typify your opponents as being far right, far left. They're always at the outside of the political spectrum, right? So during the 8 years of President Obama's administration, he was called a socialist, right? Now in the early years of the Trump administration, he's called a fascist, right? So, in many respects, we try to peg the other as being way out there, outside of the norms of acceptable society. The second thing is essentially trying to prove that your opponent is a hypocrite, right? And what you do is you try to find some footage that person said 5 years ago and compare it to what they said now. Or you try to find some internal inconsistency in their ideology. Well, how could you say that and say this at the same time, right? So trying to prove that the other person actually isn't who they say they are, that they're hypocritical, is part and parcel of the outrage industry. It also it makes the assumption that ideology is always consistent regardless of where you are. And then finally, the idea that our story is real and your story is biased, right? So the other side is always doing something ideological. We're giving you the real news, right? So add this idea of the rise of outrage to all the other different things that we saw, And together it has kind of created this culture of disunity in American politics. And we will come back and talk about ideology.